Hey everyone, this is Jordan Peterson, and despite what he may say,
I'm not doing too bad. How are you?
Good, actually, all things considered.
he hasn't been doing so well lately.
So I have no idea what the court means by, abiding by the rules. Number one, what the hell? And number two, bring it on and see what happens. Because I will make absolutely every bit of this public in a way that the college and the courts can hardly even imagine. So away we go. So that's how I'm doing.
That's how you're doing, okay.
This isn't exactly new for Jordan. I was gonna include a brief history of all the very strange crises this guy has had just in the last couple of years, but honestly, if you don't know about any of that, I think that you're much better off without that information taking up space in your brain that could be better devoted to cherished childhood memories or Shokugeki no Soma lore. With regards to this latest thing, at the beginning of 2023, the College of Psychologists of Ontario, after receiving a number of complaints, ordered Peterson to undergo a social media training course. Now, first of all, while I'm not trying to minimize any implications that this has for freedom of speech, yet, but if you're at all aware of what Peterson is like on Twitter, this is kind of hilarious. Like, Peterson was banned from the platform in June of 2022 after he refused to delete a post dead-naming Elliot Page, and I wouldn't say that he took that very well.
I've essentially been banned from Twitter. I have been suspended. But the suspension will not be lifted unless I delete the hateful tweet in question, and I would rather die than do that. My tweet violated the Twitter rules. What rules, you sons of bitches? And I'm not taking down that tweet or acknowledging that my tweet violated the Twitter rules. Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
But Peterson's ban was personally lifted by Elon Musk after he bought Twitter, a decision that I would argue has done more damage to Peterson's mind than when his doctor prescribed him benzos. Since coming back to the platform, he's said that a plus-size Sports Illustrated cover model wasn't beautiful enough, heavily opposed Justin Trudeau banning conversion therapy in Canada, jokingly told strangers to kill themselves, shared a number of conspiracy theories, including a video that I can't show here where a man is having his penis milked, claiming that it was something that the Chinese government is doing to its citizens when in reality it was fetish porn from Britain, as well as posting way more Joker memes than you'd probably want from someone with clinical psychologist in their bio.
I expressed political sentiment, and I'm actually informed. And so, for the life of me, I can't see how I'm wrong.
Peterson tried to fight the college's decision in court, but they ruled against him, saying that while he is free to express his opinions, so long as he's presenting himself as an authority as a clinical psychologist, which, as far as I can see, he is, then the college is allowed to tell him to tone it down. Peterson feels very differently and sees this as an attack on his freedom of speech.
But I have freedom of speech. It's like, do I now? What do I get to talk about? Apparently, I can't even talk about the weather.
He released this video where he goes over everything with his daughter Michaela and says that he's going to continue to fight it while claiming that this is all because he criticized Justin Trudeau.
There's what? There's a rule, eh? There's a rule, is that right? That the College of Psychologists has that I can't criticize Justin Trudeau on Twitter. That's a rule, is it? And if someone anywhere in the world complains about the fact that I've criticized Justin Trudeau, let's say, that all of a sudden that's a rule, even though it wasn't a rule. And of course I get to criticize Justin Trudeau, not only because he richly deserves it in every way you can possibly imagine, but because that's actually what freedom of speech means.
I would actually agree with him here. Being penalized for expressing his dislike of the Prime Minister, regardless of what I may think of the substance of his criticisms, would be a massive and dangerous overstep by the college. Except that it's actually a straight-up lie. Nowhere in the court documents, which you can find in the description, do they bring up any of his tweets about Trudeau. My personal opinion on this is that while I'm not a fan of a person's employer having any say over what their employees do while off the clock, A, This isn't a new phenomenon. We've all known that your employer can see what you do on social media. B, medical professionals are definitely a group who you want held to a strict code of conduct rather than just winging it. And C, I'm sorry, but you can't argue that this man is acting remotely professionally.
You're an idiot. And you might say, well, there's too many people on the planet anyways. In which case I would say, then leave.
Well,
but none of that is what this video is actually about. If you want more details about this specific video, the YouTuber and PhD in psychology holder Cass Arris just released a detailed breakdown. Instead, I'm going to try to get to the bottom of a much deeper issue. See, something that has to be said about Jordan Peterson is that even if you disagree with his ideas, the man can dress. The keen-eyed among you might even have noticed that in this video, Peterson is actually wearing a pretty interesting outfit. His suit is actually meant to look like the cover of his first book, Maps of Meaning, and I think that that detail, along with the strange colors, mismatched lapels, and the inclusion of his signature, all come together to send a bold message that this man is a failed author who fell into some radioactive waste and became a D-list Batman villain. But this isn't Peterson's only weird outfit, or his worst. That one is for sure his Twitter suit. You may have seen this one, and while I wouldn't really call anything about this outfit subtle, a couple details you may not have noticed include the lining, which is covered in pictures of real Twitter replies, and of course the tie with Elon Musk's face all over it. First of all, this is the hardest I've ever seen someone simp, but to be fair, that does line up with everything else about how Peterson acts towards Elon, so I guess that is kind of on point. But everything else aside, I just think that this suit looks bad. It fits him weirdly, and the light blue with white trim makes him look like the host of a game show where the winner just gets $8 a month from each of the contestants. F tier, let's move on. Narrowly coming in at second worst is the tuxedo he wore during his last appearance on Joe Rogan. Something not a lot of people know is that the inner lining of this blazer is covered in the faces of him and his fellow members of the so-called intellectual dark web, a group of right or right-leaning men that Peterson's friends with. And yes, they gave themselves that very cool nickname. So I don't think that the tuxedo is that bad on its own, but that added detail plus the overall lameness of wearing it while sitting across from Joe Rogan, who's just in jeans and a t-shirt, is what really puts it towards the bottom of this list. It just screams haunted ventriloquist dummy bringing a briefcase to math class. That said, I do think that a man in his 60s loving his friends so much that he has their faces stitched into his clothing is very cute, which earns him a few points there. I'm putting the Maps of Meaning suit above both of these. It's definitely not a good look, but I do think that it at least makes him look ridiculous in a way that's funny instead of sad. He looks like he's about to do his first ever performance at a drag open mic, and even though he still hasn't quite figured out how to pull off camp, I think that he deserves some encouragement there. The fact that it appears that he autographed his own blazer should make it worse, but it's such a bold move that I think it somehow elevates it. Okay, this is going to be a very controversial opinion, but I think that his best suit is this red and blue split down the middle one. Apparently it's meant to be like heaven and hell and order and chaos. To me, it just looks like he has good news and bad news. He looks like he's doing a Two-Face cosplay that's somehow simultaneously extremely expensive yet also kind of low effort. Points off for the pants not also being split down the middle. He looks like the oldest guy at a nightclub on Halloween. Also, apparently the hell side is goat's wool and the heaven side is sheep's, which is a cool concept, but I bet it makes it feel really weird to wear. So the backstory to all of these is kind of boring. A suit maker reached out to Peterson offering to make him a suit for each of his 12 rules for life. First of all, that means that there are going to be at least 8 more of these things. And secondly, I found that out from an article on the conservative comedian Steven Crowder's website. I bring this up because this article, as well as almost everything else on the site, are written by this guy Brodigan, and the way he writes is some of the worst cringe I've ever seen. What I'm here for is, as intentional as it may be, Jordan Peterson walking around looking like a base Doctor Who. No, I need this as a TV show now, and deep down, you know you do too. This reads like an alternate dimension BuzzFeed listicle about the top 10 times Mussolini was a low-key drip god. But while that, in addition to Peterson evidently having a pretty strange fashion sense, explains why he wears these particular suits, I think that there's a bit more going on here. In one interview, Peterson explains his thought process for why he dresses up, and I honestly think it's kind of nice.
Yeah, well, I talked to my father about this years ago, because he always wore a suit when he was a teacher. He's still alive. He's a teacher, and he always wore a suit. And I asked him why one day, and he said because it was his way of showing respect for the students. And I mean, I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't dress in a suit is being disrespectful, but there's something about outfitting yourself for the task at hand. And there's also something about attempting to put some effort into putting your best foot forward.
Although after that, he does lose me a bit by saying how men wearing t-shirts instead of suits is a sign of some deep rot at the core of society.
So there's some of it's just fashion, but a lot of it too is this idea that this sort of reflexive, rebellious attitude that anything that violates traditional norms or even anything that's associated with patriarchal oppression and adulthood is to be eliminated in favor of what's hypothetically a more free individuality. I was in Washington 4 or 5 years ago in the summer, and one of the things that really struck me, all these people wandering around these great monuments, is all the men looked like overgrown 10-year-olds. I thought, this is weird that adults are dressing like children and not good. And so some of it's fashion, but some of it's also that.
Dude, they're tourists. I think it's okay if people aren't in formal wear while on vacation. But also, when you think about this and just how image-obsessed Peterson is in general, like, not just with his suits, but also how in so many pictures or videos he's always in a big leather chair or standing in front of an old bookshelf, it feels like it's extremely important to him that he sells this image of a wise old patriarch. And I think that that reveals something really telling, both about the appeal of Jordan Peterson and manosphere figures like him, as well as modern masculinity in general. And so, in this video, we're going to talk about that. But first, I think I should show you folks a little respect too. So, let me suit up.
Using our Goldfinch by William Lewin pocket square. We start off just by folding in half. And then for this next fold, it really does depend on the width of your pocket.
What's more Jordan Peterson than sitting in my messy bedroom while wearing my now tax-deductible suit? Is this good, by the way? I'm very worried that this is just going to look like I'm wearing my bar mitzvah suit. If I get comments that say that it looks like I'm wearing my bar mitzvah suit, I'm going to kill myself with booze and ether. Hey, Spider. Hey. Hey, cutie. So in my last video, which isn't necessary for understanding this one, but I'd still recommend checking it out because I worked really hard on it. I'm sorry, I've gotten notes that people really don't like it when I talk like a sexy little baby. Apparently they especially don't like that I insist on calling the baby sexy, to which I say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize we were living in North Korea. I'm just a sexy little baby. In my last video, I talked about the history of crises of masculinity in America from the early 1800s up until the 90s, showing how crises of masculinity happen along with economic shifts, and arguing that as the American economy has shifted from agrarian to industrial to post-industrial, American masculinity has gone from being seen as intrinsic part of men to something produced through labor to now being something external to be bought. For this one, we're gonna be picking things back up in the 90s, so grab your Jurassic Park slap bracelet and your rare Lewinsky Scandal edition Tamagotchi, and we're gonna talk about what happened to masculinity in the 90s. Those were all just random words to me, by the way. I was born in 1993. I don't know what a Steely Dan is. Something that becomes very clear while researching this stuff is that masculinity tends to function a lot like capitalism, with boom and bust cycles. Cycles which, coincidentally, are pretty in sync with those of capitalism. While I've argued that previous shifts in masculinity happened as a sort of indirect consequence of macroeconomic changes, as we'll see, something that's different about the changes that happened around the turn of the 21st century is that, in a lot of ways, these things were a bit more intentional. One thing that seems to stay the same no matter what, though, is that at basically any time in history, especially if there's been some kind of major shift, guys will insist that men today have gotten soft compared to past generations. And the soft boy boogeyman of the 90s was what a lot of scholars have called the new man, better known as the metrosexual. This was a guy who paid attention to fashion, had a skincare routine, went to therapy, and even washed his ass from time to time. The term metrosexual was originally coined in 1994 by the journalist Mark Simpson in an article published in The Independent titled "Here Come the Mirror Men: Why the Future is Metrosexual." In it, Simpson describes the metrosexual as a single young man with a high disposable income, living or working in the city, because that's where all the best shops are, is perhaps the most promising consumer market of the decade. In the 80s, he was only to be found inside fashion magazines such as GQ, in television advertisements for Levi's jeans, or in gay bars. In the 90s, he's everywhere, and he's going shopping. So, in most of the ways that the metrosexual man has been covered by journalists, including Simpson himself, as well as academics, the focus will be on how vain these guys supposedly are, or else, examining why it might be that men engaging in traditionally feminine activities might provoke that as an insult. I can't imagine why that would happen, though. By the way, something with Simpson is that a lot of his writing, including the excerpt I just quoted, kind of makes him sound really shitty, and part of the reason for that is that he is being taken out of context a little bit. That's not to say that that quote meant something completely different, but that when you actually read one of his articles, it's very clear that he's trying to be funny, but in a way that's pretty dated and doesn't really translate very well, especially when his quotes are put beside dry academic writing. Like, personally, when I first read that line about metrosexuals, my first thought was that this guy sounds like a massive piece of shit. Like, chill out, dude. Let boys go to the mall. But it's also important to bear in mind that not only was Simpson trying to be funny there, but also this was written in the 90s when there absolutely was a trend of straight guys appropriating aspects of gay culture, a trend that Simpson, who was, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, a middle-aged bitchy gay man who was making fun of this trend. He still has written a lot of stuff that I think is pretty rough no matter how you slice it, though. For example, in the follow-up article he wrote for Salon in 2002, Meet the Metrosexuals, some of the examples he gives of metrosexuals are David Beckham because he liked being photographed and took a lot of sponsorship deals, Barack Obama, who he says was the first American president to be his own first lady, and one of the craziest things I've read in a while, Tobey Maguire in the first Spider-Man movie, a film which Simpson claims offers us the kinky, fetishistic spectacle of a geeky, ordinary young man whom no one notices, transformed into a raving metrosexual before our very eyes, apparently injected with steroids and ecstasy by a gay spider. He admires his new buff body with widening eyes in the mirror, dresses up in a tight lycra gimp suit, and runs around a lot on all fours with his arse in the air. After having set up web cameras to record his sexploits, Peter Parker / Tobey Maguire employs designer drugs, clothes, perverse sexuality, and multimedia technology to get people to look at him as he swings between the billboards and skyscrapers from what appear to be his own hardening jism. In one memorable bondage / mummification resonance scene, he hangs upside down in his gimp suit while Kirsten Dunst peels off the lower part of his mask to kiss him before replacing it. A perfect example of the new power dynamic between metrosexual men and women, and how metrosexual men have to be the center of attention. We're supposed to believe that Toby is motivated by old-fashioned virtues of social concern and love for Kirsten, but we don't believe it for a moment. Nor does, in the end, the movie. Kirsten finally offers herself, but Toby declines, realizing that she would come between him and his real love, his metrosexual alter ego in the Dayglow gimp suit. Fellas, is it gay for the protagonist at the end of a hero's journey to choose needs over wants? Anyways, I just think it's good to give the proper context that that was written by an edgy gay guy rather than how I think Mark usually comes off when I've seen him quoted in the research I did for this video, which is as a homophobic psychopath. I just want to know whether or not someone's describing Spider-Man's costume as a Dayglow gimp suit for the right reasons, you know? I am going to defend him a bit more later on, so look forward to that, but he does obviously have a lot of terrible takes, specifically when he talks about the ways that metrosexual men are vain, or what he thinks Spider-Man's webs are made of. In his book, Metrosexual Masculinities, Matthew Hall points out how there's been a long history of men caring a lot about dressing up, and an almost equally long history of them being ridiculed for it. We can see this with the 17th century fop, the 18th century macaroni, which the context for that one was that rich British boys would go on a big Euro trip as a coming of age thing, and the term macaroni started being used for guys who'd come back from Italy wearing big white wigs, which, first of all, it's been fun how a lot of the research for my last few videos has been about learning how much Europeans hate Italians. Also, I just like how that's more or less a thing that still happens today, except instead of anti-Italian discrimination, it's just me making fun of my friend who picked up an accent during his semester abroad, something which I consider to be the result of a complete lack of moral character. If he'd come back home trying to make some white powdered wig work, I'd have no choice but to cut him out of my life. This dude fully came back with a French accent after one semester in Montreal. Like, saying Poutine is one thing, but he was fully throwing a on his R's. Getting back on track here though, the 19th century brought us the dandy, and then the names really take a sharp nosedive with the flaming heterosexual of the 20th century, and then metrosexual around the 90s and aughts. While the phenomenon is nothing new, Hall points out how previously it was only rich guys who'd publicly care about their looks. While men of all incomes would pay attention to those things too, it was largely in a way that was kind of invisible. This changed with Gen X. That's right, you 50-year-old fucks have been skating by on being too apathetic to get a negative generational stereotype for too long, and I'm changing that today! What was I talking about? Right, getting back on track. Starting in the 90s and continuing to grow ever since, men have been spending more and more time and money on grooming. While shaving products and bar soap used to be two of the top grooming products that men said they couldn't live without, a study by L'Oreal found in 2010 that they'd been replaced, with 67% of men interviewed instead naming artificial tanners and 65% saying sun protection. Not only did a 2012 study also find that this trend was consistent across all wealthy countries in Europe, North America, and Australia, but the same trend holds in poorer countries too, particularly in China, where the male beauty industry grew by 20% in 2012, and even more dramatically in India, where in 2013 a survey of men found that they reported increasing their monthly spending on cosmetics by 50%, surpassing women. This trend has even been found to be recession-proof, with British men reporting that they were still spending over £10 a week on cosmetics in 2012 despite economic downturns. This was all, of course, accompanied by a surge of amazing new products like guy liner and mascara, moisturizers for dudes that claim that, unlike that girly shit, this stuff uses science to make you stronger. And my personal favorite, Alpha Nails, a nail polish company for dudes, which of course came as a stick so that guys could avoid applying it with a limp wrist. I feel like there should have been a competitor called Sigma Nails where you just shoot color at your nails with a gun. Hey Spider. Hey Spider. Hey Spider. Hey Spider. Regardless, all these companies were undeniable trailblazers, finding bold and innovative new ways to scream no homo. This is a very well-established and kind of hilarious phenomenon, by the way. Whenever men do something that's in some way traditionally feminine, they always tend to reframe it as manly. While this isn't a particularly shocking thing to hear, it is kind of amazing when you see how far-reaching this phenomenon is. For example, one study from 2007, which I think is probably a little dated now, looked into men's diets, which are generally much less healthy than women's. The study found that even the men who did actually eat healthy did so while completely rejecting any diet advice, and instead, this is real, talked about how they did it because it fit into their roles as hunter-gatherers. Another study interviewed bodybuilders who insisted that the reason they were doing that was because of very real and practical manly concerns about being strong, even though real strong men don't look at all like that. Bodybuilding contests are actually basically just male beauty pageants. Same goes for men in traditionally female professions like teaching or nursing. A study from 2005 found that when asked about their work, these men would find ways to emphasize the technical skill involved in order to avoid drawing attention to how their jobs involve providing help and support to vulnerable people, like a fucking bitch! I'm just saying, why are you as a man spending your days helping the young, the old, and the sick? Now, we'll come back to these kinds of products later, but before we move on, I am genuinely very stoked to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Henson Shaving Razors. Hi, and welcome to the side of the room that I'm normally looking at while filming. So, something that you may not know about me is that I'm not just a rat in the cage that is YouTube content creation. I'm also an unapologetic big Turk enjoyer, and more importantly, a safety razor guy, which means that on the rare occasion when I leave the apartment to journey into the flesh world, I will rant to anyone I can about how much better it is to shave this way. And so I'm really living the dream right now by getting to talk about this without even venturing beyond the walls of my prison. I'm going to try to safety razor pill you right now. Here we go. The kind of razor that you probably use is called a cartridge razor, and they're kind of bullshit. First of all, I think that any product that gets locked up behind glass at the drugstore is probably made by a company that you should hate, or it's lube. Maybe it's just me, but I've never been embarrassed buying lube before, but having to find an employee to unlock it for me is my new stress nightmare. But even when you buy them online, they're still way more expensive than they should be, and you'll probably get locked into a subscription. They're also bad for the environment since they're disposable plastic, and finally, you get a worse shave. I realize this is gonna make me sound like one of those people who claims that you don't actually need deodorant or something, but it's genuinely nuts that these companies have convinced people that more blades are better, to the point where they all compete to see who can add the most, when literally a single blade is way better. The more blades a razor has, the more likely it is to cause nicks, razor burn, and ingrown hairs. Plus, the space between each blade is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. The alternative is a safety razor. It's literally just 3 pieces of metal, so it's never going to break on you or need replacing. It takes one double-sided razor, which this is a pack of 100 blades. Cheap subscription companies will charge $1.50 to $2 per cartridge. This box costs $10, and genuinely, you get a way better shave with this. One of my favorite things too is that when I shave, I do it twice, once with the grain and then once against it to get that like baby smooth feeling, and it doesn't give me razor burn. Straight up, the reason safety razors aren't more popular is because their biggest disadvantage is just that they're a much worse business model, since instead of getting trapped into buying stuff forever, you literally just buy a razor once and that's it, which I feel like that points to some type of structural issue or something. Anyways, Henson has been shockingly cool to work with. Like, they actually told me that they were fine with me just plugging safety razors in general instead of focusing on their product, which was really refreshing. As for their razor, this isn't a review. I am being paid by them, but I wouldn't say this if it wasn't true. I've been using a safety razor for about a year now and switched to theirs a month ago, and I find it so much nicer than my old one. The one I was using was like rounded on the top part and then had a sort of lip that came out, which caused me to cut my face when I was first learning or just not paying attention. The Henson one instead has a flat edge that is very noticeably easier to use. Oh yeah, and if you're still not convinced, then guess what, sunshine? Remember when I said that 100 razors are only 10 bucks? I fucking lied. If you go to hensonshaving.com/weireinhell or click the link in the description, then these razors are free. Get out of here. You disgust me. Hey, so first of all, how do we feel about me like switching up where I've been filming? It's a lot more work this way, but I also have no idea if it'll look good. So coming back to Mark Simpson now, while his stuff about male vanity and film analysis is just bad, the reason I've been defending him is because the place where I'd say that he is actually extremely insightful is in what he thinks caused this shift in men. First of all, he points out how one big factor was the increased influence and acceptance of gay culture in the early aughts, especially with the original Queer Eye premiering in 2003. But Simpson and a number of actual scholars point out another change that was happening well before then. Beginning in the 60s and 70s, there was a sharp increase in women entering the workforce. People were getting married later and had more access to divorce, all leading to a general decline in the nuclear family. And most importantly for us, guys were remaining single well into adulthood and needing to take care of themselves. And this was a problem for capitalists. See, the way things used to work was that men would be the breadwinners, and a part of women's work was to make the vast majority of purchasing decisions for the home. A problem that was emerging now that men were starting to have to be adults on their own was that not only had they not been taught to be good enough consumers, they were actively hostile to the prospect. And so, starting in the 80s, corporations got to work teaching men to stop worrying and love to shop. One of the main forms that this took was men's magazines. While these have existed well before the 80s, before then, they were a lot more geared towards advice, and what commercial aspects there were didn't have much to do with fashion. This all changed with a surge in new fashion and lifestyle magazines for men in the 80s. Now, if you've read a men's health magazine, which odds are not that many people watching this have, in a paper by the sociologist Tim Edwards, he argued that it's not at all a given that these magazines were started to meet a demand rather than to create a new one. This is supported by studies that have found that these magazines have kind of always been mocked and disliked by men. That may be for good reason though, because a lot of stuff in these magazines isn't great. You know how you'll sometimes hear just like the shittiest guys bring up things like how men are held to impossible beauty standards just like women, leaving out of course that it's men not women telling boys that they need to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. But the thing is that while this is obviously nowhere near as bad for guys as it is for women and girls, there genuinely are growing numbers of young men and boys suffering from severe body image issues. This has been referred to as the Adonis complex, which in extreme cases causes body dysmorphia around muscle and penis size. And it kind of makes sense when you look at some of these magazines. One study by Susan Alexander examining the magazine Men's Health found so many articles that encourage unbelievably unrealistic and unhealthy body standards, including one article titled "How to Become a Greek God," where they give scaled down measurements of the Dora Forest statue and suggest exercises that could help readers achieve similar proportions. For example, a 52-inch chest. It probably doesn't need to be said, but just for some context, a 52-inch chest is a tight double XL and is about 10 inches bigger than the average man's chest. It is genetically impossible for the vast majority of men to ever get even close to that, and ridiculously irresponsible for a health magazine to be suggesting that that's a reasonable goal if you just do enough bench presses. But while all of that's not great, Alexander argues that there's something more going on. The point of these magazines wasn't just to move creatine or for the magazines to be products themselves, but instead, the real thing that they were selling was socializing men to be better consumers. And I realize that this all sounds very wishy-washy, but as much as I do love some good academic bullshitting, this is a bit more than that. Another study looked at two different men's magazines, Unlimited and Real Edge. These magazines are kind of special. They were started in 1994 and 99 respectively, but not by fashion companies or journalists, but by the cigarette companies Philip Morris and Brown and Williamson. Both these companies saw the rise of men's magazines as a golden opportunity to build a deeper, longer, and more profitable relationship with their customers. And so, they decided to get in on the action by launching men's magazines of their own that could educate young male smokers about which watches pair best with nicotine-stained fingers. And they didn't half-ass this either. Both companies conducted rigorous psychological research. Philip Morris hired the market research company The Looking Glass Group, who conducted studies on different demographics of smokers, which in the case of these magazines were male smokers aged 21 to 29. The report is kind of hilarious though, because in their findings they're basically just like, yeah, these guys are fucking morons, or as they put it, they do not take a broad intellectual interest in the world around them. They like being out, having fun with their buddies rather than sitting at home reading and contemplating. Most seem to prefer spending a free evening with their buddies in a bar, drinking, smoking, chasing women, playing darts, shooting pool, or as a last resort, spending time with their wives or girlfriends. Damn, I thought for sure that if there was anyone who loved and respected me, it'd for sure be cigarette companies. Can't trust anyone these days. The magazines would feature ads for cigarette companies, but aside from that, nothing in the articles would suggest that they were at all related to smoking. Instead, they did something much sneakier. The articles are pure dudes rock shit, focusing on weird and dangerous sports or just hot babes. The idea wasn't to directly advertise smoking, but instead to construct a version of masculinity that would create more smokers. Rather than trying to sell cigarettes by claiming that they make you cool or aren't actually that bad for you, instead, they'd sell an idea that being a real man means engaging in dangerous activities. Then put an article about cobra juggling next to an ad for Marlboros. And I think that Men's Health is doing the same thing, although with a lot more subtlety. Also, coming back to Jordan Peterson now, I think that this actually explains one of his strangest controversies. This tweet responding to the first plus-size cover model for Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. So, I don't think that there's much use in me explaining how dumb and weird this tweet is. By now, everyone's already weighed in, and if you've made it this far into the video, I can't imagine that you're unsure at all about how fucked up and weird this is. One thing I do find very funny and weird about all of this, though, is just like, what does Peterson see as his role in all of this? You know? Like, why does he see this as his important job to be the arbiter of? Like, I think that the model is definitely beautiful, and in fact, it strikes me as messed up that it was seen as a big deal for this very conventionally attractive woman to be on the cover in the first place. But imagining if Sports Illustrated released a cover with a model who I actually thought looked hideous, I think that my response would probably just be something like, huh, that's weird. I wouldn't throw a temper tantrum because the bikini lady isn't hot enough. Like, does Jordan Peterson still jerk off to the Sears catalog? Who cares? But we do actually kind of get an answer to this in an interview he did on his daughter's podcast. And, oh man. First of all, he very much doubles down by saying that there is an objective ideal female body, and he has a very specific idea of what that is.
You have to be young, you have to be female, generally, you have to be extremely athletic, you have to be shapely in a very particular way, and that would be with a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.68, because that's what's been established cross-culturally as ideal from the perspective of male sexual interest, let's say, but that's also associated with fertility.
Yeah.
And so.
Now, I'm no clinical psychologist. Interestingly, that's something that Peterson and I might soon have in common. But It strikes me as pretty messed up for a father to confidently run down the exact specs of the ideal female body to his daughter. It seems messed up to me. There's also this part where he addresses how people have brought up how what's been seen as the ideal female body has changed throughout history.
So you could say, well, it's a westernized form of beauty. It's like, yeah, and you can point to Rubens' paintings of more plump women and say, well, there's an exception.
And it's like, yeah, that's a very good point. What's been seen as the ideal female body type has changed a lot between cultures and throughout history, which seems to suggest that it's not objective after all. But I'm not cutting anything here. After he brings that criticism up, he just doesn't respond at all, but acts like he has.
Well, there's an exception. It's like, great. You think you're a genius for finding that exception. Good for you. You know the Rubens painting. Like, more power to you. But that doesn't mean anything at all about the universality of images of beauty. And so the cover bothered me a lot.
I don't have anything to add here. I just think that's such a crazy thing to do. But the most interesting thing to me is when Peterson actually starts explaining why he felt so strongly about the photo.
Sports Illustrated hit the gold mine with their swimsuit cover, I suppose 20 years ago, whenever they established that. Because it was obviously it's a sports magazine, so it's about athletics. It's about athletic people. It's about athletic bodies. And they had a swimsuit issue, and it really was a big hit. And then it became kind of a cultural icon. And it's a very specific kind of cultural icon because it focuses on a very exceptional kind of high-end beauty.
He talks about the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition like it's part of the Western literary canon, which seems completely bizarre, except, I think, when you start to think of these kinds of magazines as serving the purpose of selling an idea of gender, a business that Peterson also happens to be in. But we'll come back to this later on. First, I want to go more into the figure of the metrosexual that was being crafted in the 80s and 90s. One big thing to point out here is that along with all his other characteristics, the new man was also a feminist. Now, I want to be careful here. This is a radical claim that I'm about to make, but I believe that two things can and often are true at the same time. Three is impossible, and any more than that doesn't even deserve a response beyond seek help. So as much as I've been critical of all this, I do think that guys becoming feminists, caring about their feelings, and washing their asses from time to time are all great things. But also, the reason why the metrosexual man was so in touch with his feminine side was absolutely a cynical decision, and also kind of a lazy one too. In his book, Reading Ads Socially, Robert Goldman describes how in the 80s, advertisements for women had become a common target for feminist criticisms, and so, seeing that they couldn't beat them, advertisers began appropriating third-wave feminist critiques into their ads. This essentially distilled feminism, boiling off all the politics and anything that could be truly oppositional, leaving just aesthetic signifiers and girl power slogans behind. Goldman calls this commodified version of feminism commodity feminism, a term that I'm bringing up purely because Goldman makes a really big deal of drawing attention to how it's a pun on commodity fetishism. The pun, commodity feminism, is a reminder that commodity relations turn the relations of acting subjects into relations between objects. The pun's motive invites readers to realize double meanings and thereby generates a new meaning for a product, look, or fashion style. Have you ever read a joke bombing before? I feel like Goldman's doing the academic version of going, you'll get that one on your way home. And so, as men's lifestyle magazines began to construct a new version of masculinity around the same time, it's not too surprising that they use this exact same toolkit. But there was a significant backlash to all of this. I talked about this more in my video about pickup artists, but essentially, along with the creation of the new man came what Michael Kimmel calls the new lad, or more simply, the bro. In a lot of ways, the new lad seems like a return to traditional masculinity, but I think that there are some really crucial differences. And so, let's compare how the new lad is depicted to how the traditional man was. In a pretty influential paper by Robert Brennan, he lays out the four main characteristics of traditional masculinity, all of which he gave silly little nicknames to. First, we got number 1, no sissy stuff. This means that real men can never resemble women or do feminine things. Instead, they should be doing man shit, like avoiding cosmetics, not caring about their clothes or hygiene, repressing their emotions, especially when it comes to showing affection to other men, and devaluing girly crap like children and poetry. The next and most confusing one is number 2, the big wheel. This means that a real man should achieve wealth, fame, or really just status, generally through their job, although not always. For instance, his status might come from his dope-ass tricycle instead. Oh hell yeah, dude, just look at that thing. Raw power. Honestly, and this might just be because of my lack of knowledge of 70s slang, but I'm only now realizing that none of the names other than number 1 are at all intuitive. Anyway, number 3 is the sturdy oak, which means conveying confidence, stoicism, and self-reliance, for some reason. Finally, the last and for sure worst is number 4, give 'em hell, which means that men should be violent and aggressive. This is especially bad because it isn't supposed to be directed to other men, but instead is meant to be a way to get women. So on that horrifying note, let's move over to the new lad, who, despite everything, is at least a bit of an improvement on the old model. One big difference is that instead of using violence to flirt, bros are more likely to use what Daniel Cortez and Pamela Ling call new sexism instead. New sexism involves couching things in little disclaimers, like "I'm not a sexist, but," as well as condemning older, more overt forms of sexism, while also still being kinda gross in a way that makes their criticisms of sexism seem almost utilitarian, if that makes sense. For example, in one article from Real Edge, they talk about the very 2000s survival race show Eco Challenge. And specifically, the one team made up of Playboy models. The author is very quick to make fun of the contestants who thought that the playmates wouldn't be able to compete, while also very much treating said contestants as sex objects. There's also a very heavy presence of what gets referred to as certitude, which here means an exaggerated emphasis on biological determinism. This is shit like saying, "Us guys are simple creatures. All we need to be happy are boobs, beer, and bacon." This basically describes any advertisement aimed at men throughout the 90s and aughts. They're all just like, if you're a man, then that makes you a disgusting fusion of a caveman and a 12-year-old boy. So buy Crocs, you fucking moron. Probably the most wild example of this was an ad by Burger King called Manthem, which is a musical about a guy at a fancy restaurant with his girlfriend who decides that enough is enough.
I am man, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore, and I'm way too hungry to settle for chick food. 'Cause my stomach's starting to growl, and I'm going on the prowl for a Texas double whopper. Man, that's good.
Yeah, a man shouldn't have to settle for eating gourmet food with the woman he loves. He should be out in the streets, eating fast food and performing musical theater numbers with the boys. From here, he goes on to lead a revolution where he and other men cast off their shackles of oppression while parodying slogans from real social movements like "I am woman, hear me roar," as well as "I am a man," which was used during the civil rights movement. It ends with them flipping an SUV off of a bridge, showing their freedom from the most cucked of all utility vehicles. Then, they chain it to a strong man who pulls it while being led around by a hot chick holding a Whopper on a shovel. Yeah, baby, real men don't want quiche on a silver platter. They want to be shoveled slop like a farm animal as they perform manual labor. But as dumb as all of this is, I also think that it's kind of fascinating. Remember that this was all a backlash to metrosexuality, which wasn't just the feminization of men, but also the commodification of masculinity. This is what makes metrosexuality so interesting to me. Well, to be clear, this wasn't the actual start of masculinity becoming a commodity. I do think, though, that it's fair to say that metrosexuality marked the point when the frog had finally been boiled. This is also Simpson's most profound observation, which is why I've defended him and even given him a pass on his Spider-Man review. He pointed out that while the backlash to metrosexuals did end the trend of straight men mimicking gay culture, The thing that it didn't change was that from this point on, masculinity had become a consumer category, and this is all still very much going on today. While the metrosexual fell out of fashion in the aughts and was replaced by the hipster in the 2010s, and now I'd argue that basically all expressions of masculinity are done through buying things. But enough of these critiques of postmodern society. Let's get back to talking about what you came here for. Men's rights! Sorry. So, in her book, Empowered, Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny, Sarah Bennett Weiser argues that the phenomenon of feminism becoming co-opted and robbed of its radical critiques to serve the interests of neoliberal capitalism isn't just the result of cynical corporations, but also a consequence of existing in an attention economy in which visibility and therefore palatability come to be seen as a social movement's main goal. This ironically presents a problem for misogynists, though, since misogyny is always a reaction against feminism, either to prevent whatever new social change is happening or to go back even further. That means that when it succeeds, it's not rewarded with visibility in the same way, since its goal is just to keep things the way they already are. It's like when you see people complain about how, like, if there's black history, there should also be white history, and it's like, yeah, that's just the history that normally gets taught. But to be fair though, maybe I'm being too harsh here, so let's dive into the men's rights movement now and see what it's really all about. The first interesting thing to note is that men's rights were originally an offshoot of feminism. The second wave feminists focused a lot on critiquing the roles that women were forced to occupy in society, and eventually this led to a lot of men starting to ask questions about their roles too, and deciding that they weren't particularly happy about them either. These first MRAs realized that the pressures being placed on men were forcing them to work dangerous jobs, go to war, and repress their emotions, preventing them from having meaningful relationships with their friends, wives, and children. And they saw feminism as a potential path to liberation. But all base things must someday come to an end. The third wave feminists came around, and while they still cared about the roles that men and women are made to occupy, they also started raising some uncomfortable questions about how men, male feminists included, treated women. The men's rights movement responded to this with a resounding, whoa, 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 whoa. First of all, calm down. Secondly, we're gonna go. We're gonna go. We're gonna go. From here, the men's rights movement split into roughly three groups. There were guys who stuck around despite being expected to occasionally do some self-reflection. They basically just became male feminists. There was also the mythopoetic men's movement, who were very much about how patriarchy hurts men and had decent critiques of capitalism and consumer society too. They'd also form men's groups and go into the woods and do weird caricatures of indigenous rituals. Basically, I think that in some ways they were very cool, and in other ways incredibly cringe. There's also a contingent of guys who pretty much just became MRAs as we know them today. They still supported some aspects of feminism, but mostly just liked that women were becoming more sexually liberated in that it made it easier for these guys to get laid. Otherwise, they came to blame feminism for basically any other problems in their lives. Honestly, they seem like a bunch of losers who I'm sure we'll never hear about again. Just kidding, this is Hell World, baby! So naturally, that was the group that stuck around and continues to be relevant to this day. Now, again, I don't want to be too mean here without a good reason, so let's take a look at what men's issues these groups care so much about and see if there's anything there. Some of them do seem pretty valid. For instance, they talk a lot about the difficulties that male victims of abuse face when coming forward, since they're often ignored or not taken seriously. This absolutely can happen. In fact, I've experienced it. I've been in an abusive relationship, and when I tried to tell my friends what had happened, I was ignored or told that it was no big deal. So yeah, drawing attention to that seems like it could absolutely be a good thing. However, while I am very empathetic here, I'm also a statistics nerd, and so I want to take a closer look because some of their claims are pretty fishy. For instance, it's common for MRAs to bring up a statistic that says that men and women abuse their partners at roughly equal rates, and in some sense, that is true. It comes from a study that gave men and women a list of violent or abusive behaviors and asked if they'd ever done anything on that list in the past year, and the results were pretty much equal. If, however, you ask any follow-up questions like how often, how severe, or who initiated it, well, then the results show that it was overwhelmingly done by men to either women or other men. But hey, that's just one of many debunked studies. Again, I want to be fair here, and so let's look for an expert. Someone who I think is pretty uncontroversially respected in the movement is Dr. Warren Farrell. This isn't some fringe weirdo who's trying to get the Supreme Court to rule that nightclubs having ladies' nights is discrimination. Real thing that a guy tried to do, by the way. Now, Farrell's been interviewed by everyone who's anyone and has some pretty impressive credentials.
Warren has been chosen by the Financial Times as one of the world's top 100 thought leaders. He is currently the chair of the commission to create a White House Council on Boys and Men. He's the only man in the U.S. to have been elected 3 times to the board of the National Organization for Women, NOW, in New York City. Dr. Farrell has appeared repeatedly on Oprah, Today, and Good Morning America, and has been the subject of features on 2020 in Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, People, Parade, and the New York Times.
Surely this is a reasonable guy who knows what he's talking about. He said, foreshadowingly, of Farrell's 5 books, the one I'm most interested in talking about here is The Myth of Male Power, a foundational text in the men's rights movement in which he argues that men don't actually have social or economic control in society, and in fact are the ones who are systemically disadvantaged. One part that's particularly interesting is in a chapter called The Politics of Sex, where Farrell argues that sexual harassment legislation is bad, actually, and that instead, when workplace sexual harassment happens, the victim should simply tell the perpetrator to stop. Amazing stuff, deeply powerful mind. Actually though, it's about to get so much worse, and in a way that you aren't expecting. I know. In one part, Farrell breaks down the different types of sexual relationships that can develop in a workplace and the problems with each of them. One of these is an employee dating her boss. He points out that this can be problematic due to the power dynamic that this creates, not because the employer could easily abuse his employee though, but instead, Farrell's concern is that this might undermine the boss's authority or lead to the employee getting unfair preferential treatment. Worst of all, this isn't the bad thing that I was telling you about. It still gets so much worse. We aren't even close to the bottom. What makes this particularly fucked up, though, is that Farrell gives each type of relationship a nickname, and for this one, he calls it workplace incest. The reason why is because when it is consensual, employer-employee sex has one of the same problems of parent-child incest. It undermines the ability of the employer to establish boundaries because the employer often feels needy to the employee. It is this same problem that is at the core of parent-child incest. Parental authority becomes undermined because the child senses it has leverage over the parent. When only one employee has this leverage, it is also a setup for workplace jealousy and resentment. So, personally, if I were to say what I thought the problems at the core of a father molesting his daughter are, I'd probably say the pedophilia, followed by the sexual predator having complete control over his victim, followed by the incest. And I'd probably put the possibility that the victim might leverage the situation to get a higher allowance somewhere down below, what the fuck are you talking about, you absolute fucking monster? Now, most of the book is pretty much what you'd expect, a lot of pointing out how men have throughout history been treated as disposable as workers or soldiers, as well as things like male suicide rates, which, are issues, but not ones that feminism is in any way responsible for. Like, it's generally not feminists who are the ones stigmatizing men opening up about their mental health. If I were to say what I feel like feminism is responsible for, I'd probably think of things like, women's suffrage, dresses with pockets, the popularity of Stardew Valley, not really much about sending men off to die in wars. That feels much more like something that the patriarchy did. You know, along with like domestic violence, workplace harassment, and Jason Statham movies. But I'm not just bringing that up for another easy dunk. I actually think that this tendency to be so contradictory is the most interesting thing about Farrell's book and MRAs as a whole. I think that motorcycles should die. Not the people who ride them, just the bikes themselves should all be shot. MRAs will complain about how men aren't appreciated even though they have to work all the most dangerous jobs, ignoring how in almost any of those industries when women have tried to join, they've been met with extreme hostility. They'll say how women are all gold diggers who are just trying to trap a man into providing for them, but also claim to want a trad wife and love sharing stories about women who put work ahead of marriage and wound up miserable as a result. They'll claim to want to return to hard, traditional masculinity, even going so far as to post things like this. I can't help but feel, there it is again, that my rooted feminine characteristic traits are not only holding me back, but also preventing me from being a strong male role model for not only my current partner, but also other people around me. I often feel like my current partner is occasionally more of a man than me, and despite the fact that such a thing can be interpreted as a healthy relationship, deep down, it grinds me down that I don't quite know how to be a man. But also, they'll post that on a subreddit dedicated to a man who I think it's fair to call pretty sensitive.
A close reading of 20th century history indicates, as nothing else can, the horrors that accompany loss of faith in the idea of the individual. You have no idea. I see people everywhere, all over the world. They're so demoralized, especially young people with a conscience, because they've been told since they were little that there's nothing to them but corruption and power. It's like, how the hell do you expect them to react? It is only the individual, after all, who suffers. The group does not suffer.
Hey, you thought the Peterson stuff was just clickbait, but no, I'm back, I'm bringing it all together. Jesus. It's been a long day of filming. These lights are hot. So coming back to the good doctor, for as long as he can still call himself that, something about Peterson that I didn't fully appreciate until researching this video is that whenever he's asked why he thinks he's so popular, he basically says the same thing.
A large proportion of my audience has been young men, you know, under 30, something like that. And I've spoken to them a lot about responsibility. And what's so odd about this is that of all the things that I've spoken about, what happens is if I talk about responsibilities, everyone is silent, just like they are now. Silent and not moving, right? Focusing, attentive. I had the same emotional reaction. I don't really understand it. I think it's something, there's something about it that's so crucial because, you know, we've been fed this unending diet of rights and freedoms, and there's something about that that's so pathologically wrong. And people are starving for the antidote, and the antidote is truth and responsibility.
And while I'm not quite sold on the idea that people are sick of rights and freedoms, I do think that Peterson's appeal makes a lot more sense when, for a long time, being a man was, and in some ways still is, presented as synonymous with being an idiot man-baby. What Peterson and a million grifters like him are doing is instead offering a return to traditional masculinity, or as they call it, being an adult. But while that might seem pretty open and shut, I think that there's more going on here. In a paper by Bethany Costin and Michael Kimmel, they argue that those contradictions I mentioned are key to understanding the men's rights movement. As funny as they can be at times, the men who make up this movement are facing real problems, but since they're unable or unwilling to identify the causes, they become easy targets for a movement based on nothing more than resentment. I think that Peterson's right. Young men do want to feel like an adult and take on responsibilities. In fact, they want it so badly that they're willing to listen to a guy who's telling them that doing so is mutually exclusive with having rights and freedoms. So, Costin and Kimmel argue that with this contradiction at its core, the men's rights movement is fundamentally incapable of articulating a coherent politics. But I think that there's something else going on too. While I agree with their criticism, I think that in some ways this is a feature and not a bug. As I said with Peterson, it seems a bit weird for someone who's preaching this very traditional view of masculinity to also cry so much or wear these extremely flamboyant outfits. But I think that that's the real key to his success. Peterson, like so many of his fellow merchants of masculinity, is able to appeal so strongly to these men, to the point where some of the posts on his subreddit seem to genuinely worship him, precisely because he doesn't live up to the ideal of traditional masculinity that he preaches. His popularity is the result of playing both sides at once: stoic alpha male and whimpering weirdo, traditional patriarch and modern dandy, order and chaos, masculine and feminine, blue and red. Thanks for watching.